Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to this webinar, Managing Uncertainty in Water Resource Modelling. My name is Trevor Pillar, National Partnerships Manager at iSwarm. 20 minutes for Luke and another 25 minutes or so for Q&A. Today's presenter, Dr. Luk Peeters from CSIRO, has more than 10 years experience in uncertainty analysis of groundwater and surface water models. He gained his PhD in hydrogeology from University Leuven in Belgium, and he's been very active in contributing to Australian groundwater modelling guidelines and development of the Australian Water Resources Assessment Model. So I can highly recommend Luke's work, and we look so forward today to hearing from you, Luke. It's right over to you. Once again, people, please click on your Q&A button and let's hear from you. That'll be great. Thank you. Thanks, Luke, and thanks for your time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Trevor, for this introduction and giving me the platform to spend 20 minutes talking about uncertainty in water resource modeling and where to start. And as you would probably have seen from the newsletters, this presentation is not as much about the mathematics and the stats behind uncertainty analysis. It's more about how do you set it up and how do you make sure that you can do an uncertainty analysis that is relevant for the problem at hand. So before I go into the presentation, just a bit on why on earth would you want to do an uncertainty analysis? Why do you want to spend time and effort of being less exposing how uncertain you are about your model? Now, a bit of an example, completely unrelated to water resources, but a couple of years ago I moved to Adelaide. And last year, The Economist published a list of the most livable cities in the world. And Adelaide came in at 6th. I was pretty happy about that. Obviously made a very good choice. I was looking through that list again, and then I saw that Melbourne was on number 1, which annoyed me greatly because I made the wrong choice. Should I move? It's basically my question. And you probably appreciate that just that one list is not another reason to move. And if you really want to make an assessment, whether you make to do such a big decision, you need more. You need to know what is that scoring based on, who did the scoring, and more importantly, how different is that score? What is the spread in that score? What's the variability? And that's pretty much what uncertainty analysis is about. It's providing more information than just that one number. And to me, uncertainty analysis is really about how do you communicate to your client and your stakeholders that there is not a single answer from a model, but there's a range of predictions that you can be considered consistent with how we know the system, the hydrology or the hydrogeology works. But especially in water resources, we always have limited data, limited understanding of our system, so we might be wrong. So what if we are wrong? How would that affect our predictions and conclusions? And that's pretty much what an uncertainty analysis tries to address. And the main thing to me is that uncertainty analysis is a way to be very honest and transparent on what we do and do not know. And that's the first step in trying to identify and fix knowledge gaps or build management strategies that are robust against those uncertainties. Uncertainty analysis is often a very negative term, negative connotation, and because it exposes with things that we don't know. But you can flip that around, and at the end of an uncertainty analysis, you can also use that to build confidence in what we do know. If you do an analysis and it shows that there's less than 1% chance of something occurring, even if you consider all sources of uncertainty, we're pretty confident that it's not going to occur. Just as a side note, throughout my presentation, at the bottom there, you'll find a couple of references of textbooks and papers that I found useful and that relate to the content on that slide. I probably won't point them out during the presentation, but I found them a worthwhile read. Now, before I go into the bulk of my presentation, I'll be using this hypothetical example, a bit of a generic setup inspired by the work that I've been doing in the last couple of years here in Australia. So let's say we've got an irrigation development proposed. It's not there yet, but people want to do it. There's at location D, they want to irrigate using both surface water and groundwater. Now, the system that we're looking at it's got a regulated river, so there's a couple of dams and weirs controlling the water levels and the flow in the river. The river is maximally losing or disconnected from groundwater, and the groundwater, the aquifer there, it's an alluvial aquifer. And from the geological map, we know that there's a fault present, but we don't know whether that fault is a barrier to flow or not. What else is in that aquifer? What do we care about this water resource system? Well, there's indicated with the S is a spring. We can tolerate a drawdown, a changing groundwater level up to 20 centimeters there. There's also a stock and domestic bore. We can tolerate a bit more. We can tolerate 2 meters of drawdown. And downstream from the river, there's a Ramsar wetland indicated with the R, and that needs to be flooded every 3 years, and at the same time, it can't be dry for more than 14 days in a row. So that's pretty much what we're up against, and we're being asked to build a model and do an uncertainty analysis. So the big question is, where do you start when you get a question like that? And the obvious starting point is define the objective. So everything I just presented on the previous slide, that was facts. There was no question in there. So we still need to establish, why would you build a model for this? What is the actual research question that you want to address? And that might look like something like, is the proposed development sustainable? There's no model in the world that will spit out a text file with a yes, no to that answer. So you need to make it more explicit, and you have to formally define your predictions. What are the numbers out of your model that you need to answer that research question? And in this case, it might look like, in the next 15 years, the development may not cause more than 20 centimeters drawdown at the spring, more than 2 meters drawdown at the bore. It cannot increase the no-flow days to more than 14 days per year, and it can't decrease flooding to less than 1 in 3 years on average. Now, what I've done here, this is really making it very explicit. What kind of model output do you want? On what time frame? Where do you want it? So that you really can pick out the numbers out of your model. Now, why do I spend time on this? Because this is pretty trivial, you might think. This is where a lot of the modeling exercises struggle with, to really pinpoint what they want out of the model. And this is important because you can't do an uncertainty analysis on a model. You can only do an uncertainty analysis on predictions. We've got our objectives, we've got our predictions. Now we can start looking at the system, everything that we know from the data, from the reports, and build that together into a conceptual model to create our numerical model of the system that is going to produce the numbers of these predictions to answer our objectives. Now, in the uncertainty analysis workflow, as I see it, there's 2 parallel tasks that need to happen. First one is the quantitative uncertainty analysis. Really, that is the running of the model and finding all of these predictions that are consistent with the observations and the system understanding. There's another workflow, and I won't go into detail now, that's for later in the presentation, on how you do it. And that's really, so that's really where all the numerical modeling, the maths and the stats come into. But in parallel to that, there's the qualitative uncertainty analysis. Regardless of what modeling that you do, there's always a whole list of assumptions and model choices that you need to make. And a qualitative uncertainty analysis aims at systematically discussing those to figure out why you're making those choices and what the effect on the predictions might be of those choices. And it's those 2 things together that's actually the core of the message that you need to communicate into your reports. And that's obviously that no matter what you do in your uncertainty analysis, if you can't convey that message to your clients and stakeholders, it's a pointless exercise. Now, as on the screen, this is a very linear workflow, but in reality, there's a heap of interactions between those components where you might need to revisit your conceptual model or your numerical model during the process, or even change your predictions in function of your findings. So when you're setting up a system like that, make sure that you allow for a lot of feedback and iteration in the process. Now, I'll talk about that qualitative uncertainty analysis. So, as I said earlier, it's kind of a formal structured discussion of all the assumptions and model choices in your model. So what we've been doing in a couple of projects in the past is list all of these assumptions and score them. Very simple, low, medium, high, in function of these 4 questions. Would this choice change if I had more data? Would it change if I had more time and money? Or if I had a model with more capability, would I go for a different approach? So those 3 first questions, that's about why am I making this choice, why I'm making this model assumption. But the big question is, so what? Does it have an effect on your predictions? Just in the example that I showed earlier, a couple of things. Well, I'll walk you through 2 of these aspects. For instance, incorporating the fault in a groundwater model. If you want to do that, that takes quite a bit more data than not incorporating it. You need the information on the fault, the permeability. So a lot of extra data that you need, and implementing that and including that in your uncertainty analysis will take more time and effort to do so because you're making a more complex model. And standard model codes don't often have the option to incorporate faults. So there's a lot of tinkering and trial and error in your models to get that in there. So all 3 of these attributes score high. If we start looking at what the impact might be on the result, for the groundwater, that'll be high because if the fault is impermeable, the drawdown might be very small, but if it is permeable, you might have an impact. So, but then again, on surface water, impact is going to be low because the river is disconnected. Second example would be, in this case, you might choose not to make a coupled surface groundwater model. Same reason, building a coupled surface water groundwater model, there's codes that do that, but they're a bit challenging at times. You need quite a bit of data to make it work, and even more time to get everything up and running and included in the uncertainty analysis. So scoring would be medium for data, high for resources, and medium for technical. But impact on the predictions is actually pretty low, because as long as that river is disconnected, whatever happens in the river doesn't affect your groundwater, and whatever happens in groundwater doesn't affect your surface water in this case. But that hinges on that big assumption that the river is disconnected. If that is proved to be wrong, well, that entire assumption of not coupling surface and groundwater might be not justified. Again, what I wanted to show with this is just that it is an exercise in making sure that all of this discussion, which usually is in the bulk of the technical reports, get attention in the uncertainty analysis as well. That it's not just the numbers that come out, but there's a lot of assumptions that influence your results, and that are also sources of uncertainty. Now, okay, we've done all that. We discussed our assumptions. We built our model, but how do you make a model ready to do an uncertainty analysis? Now, first of all, once you've got your model, you need to define your parameters. And I take a very loose definition of a parameter. It's any model aspect that you can change in an automated fashion. Because whatever flavor of uncertainty analysis that you'll apply, you'll need to automatically run the model a lot of times, tens, thousands of times. So you need to be able to change these things through a script. So you might need a pre-processing script to modify the numbers in your model of your parameters. You might need to do a batch file to couple some models together, and part of that would be some post-processing scripts to extract the numbers that you need, like the equivalents to your observations and your predictions. And sometimes it might be that you actually have to run the model twice to get a prediction, like when you want the difference between a baseline and a development. So all of that you need to capture in a script or in a workflow. And what we found for a very useful exercise before you do your uncertainty analysis is do a stress test of that entire workflow. Really try to break that model. Make sure that you figure out for which parameters the model works and for which it crashes, to figure out that these scripts actually do what you want them to do. And also that the model passes the laughing test. When you're producing hundreds or thousands of model results, you're not going to look at individual hydrographs or maps anymore. So this is the time to really check that these individual outcomes actually make sense and produce sensible results. And another big advantage of doing that stress test is this is when you can start doing parameter screening and trying to get the ranges of these parameters in ballpark. So you might start out with tens or hundreds of parameters. Not all of them will be important. At this stage, you can do a first culling of excluding the not important ones, or figuring out whether the range that you're exploring is too narrow or too wide and adjusting that. What about observations? So how do you bring up observations into this uncertainty analysis? Now, in the narrow definition of an observation is a measurement of a state variable, like the stream flow at a gauge. But if you look at it in a broader sense, is anything that you know about your system. For instance, in this case, we know that it's an ephemeral disconnected river. The big challenge, obviously, is how do you take all that information into your objective or likelihood function, and which likelihood function do you want to choose? So again, the likelihood function to choose, that is very much related to your prediction. If you want to make a forecast on your flood events, you want to make sure that it's able to match your high flow events and vice versa. If you're looking at base flow, you want to make sure that your system can reproduce the low flow or no flow conditions. But a bit of how to bring in soft knowledge. For instance, in this case, we know that it's a losing river. From the groundwater data, you can actually get you can do a back of the envelope calculation on what over that reach, how much the loss would be. And at least when you're looking at your river losses from the model, they should be in the kind of same ballpark. A large item that is often not given a lot of attention is acceptance criteria. How much mismatch can be tolerated? If you're doing a calibration, that doesn't really matter. You want to just minimize the mismatch. But if you're doing an uncertainty analysis, you have to define when do you say that a model is no good, when is the mismatch too much, and when do you consider it not to be representative? That is a very hard question to answer, and ideally it comes from the observation uncertainty. For instance, uncertainty in your rating curve, in how you translate the actual measurements of stage height into a stream flow. But it also comes to questions like, what is the actual minimum observable flow? So to me, in my opinion, that's where there's still a lot of work and a lot of attention that you need to spend in identifying when do you consider a model acceptable. And then we can actually get to the bulk, where most of the effort in uncertainty analysis will be spent is in the constraining parameters and predictions. And that's where the traditional software like PEST and REAM comes in. So what you do, so you've got your system set up, you've got all your scripts ready, you've done the stress testing, you defined your likelihood function and acceptance criteria. Now, the actual inference is the constraining those parameters with predictions with observations. So first of all, you define for each parameter a prior distribution. So that's just encapsulating everything you know about the system. It can be informative if you have some measurements of a hydraulic connectivity, for instance, or uninformative if you haven't got any information on that parameter. You run that through your system, and you only select those parameter combinations that are consistent with your observations. And what you'll end up with something like these green ones. So for some parameters, you're actually going to change the range of your parameters, but for some, like parameter 1, the prior and the posterior is going to be the same. As that means that your observations won't be able to tell you anything about your parameter, and that means that, and that leads to the statement that reducing parameter uncertainty doesn't necessarily mean that you're reducing your predictive uncertainty. Now, go a bit detail in that one through an example from groundwater. Let's say you've got a couple of groundwater level observations at the stars. Now, historical groundwater level observations would be affected by your recharge, either diffuse or from the river, and your hydraulic properties. Well, if you're calculating drawdown at the spring and the bore, that is determined by their hydraulic properties, but mainly by your pumping rate, but in this case also about the fault permeability. Now, if you use if you constrain with the groundwater level observations, what you will do is constrain it by you will constrain the uncertainty in your river and diffuse recharge, but you won't necessarily get a unique estimate of your hydraulic properties. And by doing so, it's those properties that your predictions depend on, so you won't really reduce that predictive uncertainty. Once we've done all that, once you've gone through all that modeling, it comes the time to report that, and that's what we're good at. It's producing these big stacks of reports. And this is what this list of steps I borrowed from risk communication. But what I wanted to show with that is that doing the modeling is just the very first step, and it's just the very first step in trying to get that message across. And if you'll read through the rest of these steps, it's much more about engaging with stakeholders and telling them what our modeling means rather than just the numbers. But it is essential to get the numbers right in the first place, but that's only the beginning. So on a bit more practical note, I like to present uncertainty as an integral part of tables, charts, and maps, just in order to avoid cherry picking. So never have individual numbers in there, but also always provide a range or a confidence interval on what you're presenting. And what we also found is that people respond differently to ways of communication. So try to get the same message out through your text, through your tables, through your charts and maps, and use them all together, because some people will resonate more to words, other more to maps or charts. And don't forget to really emphasize those assumptions that underlie your predictions, and make them also a part of the uncertainty analysis. Show that the numbers are not the endpoint of the uncertainty analysis, that there's a lot more assumptions that might affect these numbers. And the big thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that engagement with stakeholders. It's important that the people that you're talking to are numerate, that they understand, for instance, what a probability is. But it's more important that they trust you. And one of the ways to building that trust is to emphasize that the open and transparent communication. So concluding this presentation, I think that my take-home messages are: figure out what the question is, entertain the possibility that you're wrong. Observations are not just what you measure, it's everything you know. And it's important beforehand to define what you consider a good model. Doing investments, past performance may not be an indication for future results. And the only way that you can build trust with your stakeholder is by being trustworthy. So I'll leave it with this, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Luke. That was an absolutely brilliant 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. And that last slide says it all, doesn't it? Question everything. Why? It's such an emerging critical area for policy makers and planners, decision makers. Thanks so much for that. We've got a couple of questions. I just want to remind everybody to click on the Q&A icon, and if you wanted to raise your hand to ask a question on screen, that's good too. We'll notice that and we'll make sure that happens. So if we get straight to these questions then, the first one was, what sort of mismatch is it that we're talking about, Luke?
Okay, so if you, for instance, consider a groundwater model, I would say as an acceptance criteria in a regional model, I want to make sure that I match the historical groundwater levels within 1 meter. And why do I get 1 meter? Let's say the measurement itself of the groundwater level, the dipper is about 1 centimeter uncertainty, but if you add in a regional monitoring network, there's always uncertainties in your in the surveying of your monitoring point. So if you add all that up, it would be reasonable to assume that if you measure, let's say, 53 meters, the actual groundwater level at that location might be between 52 and 54. So that's what I want to capture. So in surface water, it would be, if your stream flow is 1 megaliter a day, do you want to match that between 0.9 and 1.1, or between 0.5 and 1.5? And again, that depends on your system and how well or how much trust you have in those observations.
Yep, no, thanks for that. And look, as I'm asking these questions off the Q&A screen here, everyone, feel free to ask subsequent questions out of what Luke says, but very happy to take on board that. I failed to say earlier that there's about 13 countries involved in this webinar, spread across from New Zealand, where are they? Peru, USA, Germany, South Africa, and of course Australia. So thanks for joining, everyone. It's rather large webinar today, and I'll just keep moving with these questions. How do you take into account measurement errors?
So again, it's really linking into that previous question, is that so the measurement error, that is, to me, the measurement error is, that's something that you need to know. That tells you how reliable your observations are, and that's what you need to take into account when you're defining those acceptance criteria. So it's really trying to figure out if the measured number or the observed number is 12, does that mean it's 11.9 to 12.01, or is it somewhere between 1 and 100? And working in water resources, it can be anything like that. And just being aware of those uncertainties really emphasizes how much effort you should put in matching that number. So if the uncertainty goes from 1 to 100, there's no point trying to get a match to one place after the comma.
Yep, no, thanks for that. Thanks for your question. The next question is from David. Do you ever need to provide a final discussion on the compound uncertainty from the various parameter uncertainties? So do you ever need to provide a final discussion on the compound uncertainty from the various parameter uncertainties?
Okay, so ultimately, if I understand the question correctly, what you would get out of an uncertainty analysis is that, let's say that drawdown prediction at the spring, what I would give as an answer is the median drawdown is 20 centimeters, the 5th percentile is 0.1, and the 95th percentile is 1.5 meters. So I'm providing a very wide range, if that's the range of predictions, and that range actually encompasses all sources of uncertainty that we vary during the model. So all parameter uncertainty is captured in that, and as a part of that, you can then start unpacking that, is where is most of that uncertainty coming from, and that's part of the that's one of my research interests, is really doing that analysis, saying, well, actually 90% of that range is coming from the uncertainty in your hydraulic properties, such as hydraulic connectivity and storage, and there's only 10% coming from the uncertainty in recharge. So building upon that question, building on that sensitivity analysis, you can guide further modeling efforts, as in, well, in that case, if 90% is coming from your hydraulic properties, the next step would be make sure that you reduce uncertainty in those parameters so that you can reduce your predictive uncertainty the most and that you're doing the most efficient work. Again, that's kind of the data words analysis side of things that follows on from an uncertainty analysis.
Yep, right. No, thanks for that. Simon Woodward's the next one from Hamilton in New Zealand. Can't imagine what time it is over there at the moment. Probably something like 6, 7 o'clock. Thanks a lot, Simon, for staying on board. Simon's question is, you mentioned likelihoods. Approaches for defining likelihoods that combine a range of observation types. What are the approaches for defining likelihoods that combine a range of observational types?
Again, it's how complex do you want to go? Like there is quite a lot of literature in there, and obviously the big issue is when you're combining different types of observations is how do you do that? How do you weigh these things? And how much importance do you give to each observation type? And again, there's no silver bullet. There's no one answer that I could give. What I tend to do is try to keep things as simple as possible. So what I've done in the past is define multiple criteria and define very clear-cut rules of what I consider a good model. Let's say head observations need to be matched between plus or minus a meter. So the surface water flow needs to be matched between 10 megaliters per day, and all of our simulations need to provide a gaining river system. So these are very clear, simple rules that you can communicate very easily to your stakeholders. If you go to, let's say, a full Bayesian Markov chain Monte Carlo, you have to translate that into a likelihood function, and that's where things get a bit more opaque, because you have to translate that into probability distribution function. So pick a normal distribution, a standard deviation, and a mean, all of these things. And that's a much harder exercise, first of all, to get right, and secondly, to communicate without giving the impression that you're trying to hide things. Not sure whether that answers the question, but...
Now, from Chris Turnage in CSIRO in Adelaide, he says, with regards to parameter uncertainty, have you encountered situations in which it's more useful to characterize one end of a parameter distribution than the other? For example, a high rather than low hydraulic conductivity values.
Again, comes back to the question, and what do you think is the worst outcome? So let's say if you've got a situation where an aquitard determines whether you have drawdown or not, the high end of the aquitard permeability will give rise to the highest drawdown. So if that is your main concern, that you don't want high drawdowns, what you need to focus on is that high end of the distribution of your hydraulic conductivities. The low end, well, below a certain threshold, you'll hardly see any drawdown. So whether you're off 1 order of magnitude on the low end, that's not that important, but 1 order of magnitude off on the high end may mean the difference between 1 meter of drawdown or 10 meters of drawdown. So yes, in some cases, it's important to focus on different parts of your uncertainty range.
Great. Yep. Next one, Kahit. Yes, certainly from Perth. Uncertainty in future inputs. This includes future climate, land use, and associated recharge rates, and pumping inputs. How did you address the uncertainty of the future climate?
That really comes down to how do you set up your problem, and what are the things that you're going to vary in your model. What do you consider a parameter? So if future pumping rates are uncertain, what you need to do beforehand is define that scenario. What is the range of pumping rates that you want to consider, and stochastically bring that into your predictions. Obviously, because it's future pumping rates, you won't be able to constrain that. So that is uncertainty that will just propagate straight through, and you will need to find some prior information elsewhere. For instance, from the looking at economic development plans of a region, that might give you an idea what the future pumping rates might be. Looking at climate change models might give you an idea about what the future precipitation might be, and from there on you build what your future range of recharge might be. So again, it's really upfront considering in your uncertainty what is the range that you want to consider, and then integrating that all and running that all through. But obviously every parameter that you add, your computational load increases, and there's more things to take into account.
Another one from Perth, Luke, from David Schaefer. How do you systematically take into account model structure error, model structural error?
Well, model structure error, that usually is a question, how much money do you have to spend on this project? Because if you have vastly different conceptual models, in real life world, you usually don't have that opportunity to build different conceptual models and build numerical models. So that's where that qualitative uncertainty analysis to me comes along. It's really on paper beforehand, try to find as many different conceptual models that you can think of that fit all your information. Pick the one that you think most likely to include in your numerical modeling, but then start looking at the other ones to see how that would affect your predictions. So for instance, in the example that I gave, you might go ahead with a conceptual model without a fault, under the assumption that, well, at worst, the fault would be an impermeable fault, so that would be limiting your drawdown. So even if I don't include the fault in my model, I will still be very conservative. So again, it's recognizing that you are aware of the conceptual structural errors and that you thought them true, but not necessarily work them into your numerical model. And that's the message that you can convey to your clients.
Another one from Perth, Clive Hampton. What about the requirement for parallel computing, etc., that may be required for numerous model runs?
As soon as you've got a model that takes more than 10 minutes to run, and you need to run it a couple of thousand times, any desktop machine or laptop is not going to cut it. So you need to go into high performance computing. Again, that becomes a software engineering challenge. What we found is, well, within CSIRO, we've got access to the high performance computing systems in CSIRO, but nowadays the facilities offered by, for instance, the cloud services of Google and Amazon are actually pretty amazing. But it really comes down to how do you, well, rather not go in detail because it really depends on what kind of flavor of uncertainty analysis do you want. Do you go for a best approach or a Monte Carlo sampling? There are different ways of implementing that and how you set up your different model runs.
I'll ask Joel's question. In your opinion, is it possible to combine predictive uncertainty and an optimization process, for instance, to pump as much as possible whilst maintaining groundwater levels in wetlands in a highly complex groundwater model, CPU runtime of 6+ hours? How would you tackle this issue, which is a common issue for water resource agencies that want to start using predictive uncertainty analysis?
Okay, and it's got a lot of components to that question. So first of all, model runtime. One approach that we've been using within CSIRO is model emulation. So where we try to find a statistical model that reproduces the model behavior. So it takes the same parameters and it produces the prediction that you want at the end at a fraction of the computational cost. To train something like that, you still need a couple of 100 or 1,000 original model runs. But what that allows us is to really start playing those games of optimization. Because optimization, in my experience, especially when you're taking in a lot of uncertainty and a lot of degrees of freedom, you need to start a couple of times and you might want to change the boundary conditions of that optimization, like what kind of water levels that you can allow. So that really allows you to focus on the question, what you want to optimize, rather than just the number crunching time. Like for a given set, let's say you do an original set of 10,000 model runs on a parallel computer, you might be able to do that in 2 weeks' time. But then from that database of model runs, you can actually start doing your optimization. Taking uncertainty into account, yes, that is an option. But what it does mean is that it makes the definition of your problem a bit more complex, because you're not only now saying groundwater level can't drop by more than 20 centimeters. Now you have to specify what kind of probability can you tolerate. Like, is a 95% probability of not exceeding that threshold, is that sufficient for you, or is that still too much risk? Again, that's not something that the modeling can answer. That's again for the regulator to define the level of uncertainty that they're comfortable with when doing their optimization or when doing their management.
Thanks a lot, Luke. There's a couple of questions and comments here from David Schaefer. Can we get a copy of a presentation? I just want to let everybody know that is absolutely certain. We'll send everyone a PDF of this presentation at the end. But there's a couple of others from David Schaefer. Do you use sensitivity coefficient to screen uncertainty parameters? And can PEST be used for this uncertainty analysis? Any other toolbox?
Okay. Just as a disclaimer, that's one of my pet peeves, and that's where I've been publishing on, is on sensitivity analysis and how linear uncertainty analysis might, in some cases, be misleading. Now, at this stage, that's really my academic hobby horse. In general practice, yes, as a first go, PEST will produce sensitivity coefficients, and looking at that kind of information can give you enormous insight into your model. So those sensitivity coefficients, they are incredibly useful. And the biggest problem I usually have is when you look at those sensitivity analysis, try to relate them back to your understanding of the system. So if the most important parameter turns out to be the riverbed conductance, does that make sense in the way you understand that system? If you can't explain that, then there's something wrong with the way you model or the way you understand the system. So that's one thing. The other thing is, when you compute those sensitivity indices, compute them both for your observations and your predictions. Often people just look to the sensitivity to, let's say, the root mean squared error. That's only giving you on how the model reproduces historical conditions. That doesn't tell you anything about the prediction that you want to make. So if you use those sensitivity indices, look both at the observations and the predictions.
Simon in New Zealand, when defining measurement error, should I include extra error to account for the model structure error?
Yes. Well, there's a couple of things. Like obviously, if you've got a groundwater level observation, that's just one point in space, while you might have a model grid size of 1 kilometer. So you have to take into account that kind of upscaling error. But the tricky thing is, if you're starting to allow for other sources of uncertainty or structural uncertainty, it's really about how you document that and how to be very transparent in saying, well, if I'm saying that I want to match this groundwater level observation with plus or minus 10 meters, that might look enormous, but in explaining that number, you have to justify what kind of structural uncertainty that you're accommodating in that range.
A question from USA, Geordie Battelle in Lawrence, Kansas Geological Survey. Thanks a lot for your question, Geordie. What will future predictions be relevant at all if your model only takes into account past observations? Often that's all the data you may have.
Well, if you think of it, if you look at the weather forecasts, they're accurate about a week out. Flood forecasting, they can do about a season in advance. So personally, I question any water resource prediction more than 1 year in advance. That's just reality. We don't know what the climate's going to be. Any number that comes out of our models will depend on the climate, on the precipitation. So to me, it's really about this modeling. It's not about what is the absolute prediction that you get out of it. What kind of understanding about the system can we gain? How can we set up our monitoring that if something bad happens, that we catch it in time? Can we do a scenario analysis? Can we figure out where the main risks are? I think that's way more useful information out of modeling than just the predictions.
It must be about 2 a.m. over there. So that's a decent little question from Geordie. Thanks very much, Geordie.
Thanks, Geordie.
Kate Holland in CSIRO in Adelaide. Do you have any experience incorporating conceptual model uncertainty in either qualitative or quantitative uncertainty analysis?
Yes. Yes, I have done that. I hope to publish about that someday as well. One of the things we've done before, for instance, in the past is we had a stochastic way of generating faults and the number of aquifers in a groundwater model. These are usually things that are set in stone once you go with a conceptual model, but with a lot of what's rather complex scripting before you run the model, you can actually play and get a set of stochastic realizations of how your aquifer geometry and where the faults are. So in that respect, you're actually introducing conceptual model uncertainty into your parameterization. So you're only limited to how creative you can be and how much resources you can have in scripting that and integrating that into your model. So there's a lot of ad hoc work required to get that working. And as I said before, any parameter or any component that you add to your uncertainty analysis adds to the numerical load that you have to run. But it's definitely worthwhile. And it, in our case, made it really a useful communication tool as well, saying, well, we looked at this entire range of structural uncertainty. We incorporated that in our predictive uncertainty. And even when we take all of that into account, our predictions are not more than X. So that was actually a very powerful message that we could send out at the end.
That's great. David Schaefer again, how to validate your uncertainty analysis?
That's the million-dollar question. So far, I haven't seen any. For instance, that drawdown prediction that I had in my example, that is actually a very bad prediction because you can't measure that. You can measure your groundwater level, but you can't run two, well, there's no two parallel universes where you have one universe with no development and one with development where you can actually measure what would happen if you start pumping or when you don't. So I think that is still very much an open question into how do you actually validate, how you properly validate uncertainty measures. I know in weather forecasting, they're quite ahead of us because they test it every day. And at this stage, they're at a level where if they say there's 30% chance of rain, that on 3 out of 10 days like this, it will rain, but not more. And I don't think that in water resources modeling we're there yet.
We're trying to cram a lot of stuff into 45 minutes, and thanks very much, Luke, for this, and thanks everybody for your questions. I'll do 3 more. We're at we're about 3 or 4 minutes over time at the moment. But look, let's just cut off questions for now, if you like. But everybody stay with us. I noticed, and that's terrific. A large number of people.
Just
from all around.
By the way, Trevor, I'm more than happy to follow up on this afterwards. So I think my email address is available as well. So feel free to send on any more questions.
Well, that's wonderful. Thanks a lot, Luke. Martin O'Rourke has got a comment that future predictions on climate are only as good as what you predict the climate to be. You can never be 100% certain in all predictions. They're often only a guide. It's a fair comment.
Yep.
Clive Hampton, how do we change modelling culture to move away from deterministic traditional modelling via modelling guidelines, etc.? How do we change the culture?
The main thing for me to convince people to use it is that it's doable. I think we're now at the stage that there's enough tools and that we have enough computing power that for a similar budget that you would spend on a project, you can actually do a probabilistic uncertainty analysis. So it's not just something that lives in the academic world. It is achievable in a consultancy setting, but it does open up a lot more other questions because you're not giving one answer at the end. You're giving a range of answers. So it's also the management and the clients needs to be aware of that how are they going to use that information? Do they need to change the way they think about models, how they use that information? So it's not just on the modeling practice, it's also with the clients. I don't really want to use the word educate, but it's really bring them along that it is not just, hey, we've got a number plus or minus something. It's how do you use that information at its fullest in your management?
Our last question from Kahit Yesertner in Perth, Department of Water. Structural uncertainty, how do you decide which conductance can be possibly used as a fault parameters in uncertainty analysis if we don't have enough observation points on both sides of the fault?
Okay, it's a bit of a weasel answer now, but what I've done in the past is vary faults hydraulic connectivity over 5 orders of magnitude. And that was kind of, for me, reflecting I don't know anything. It can be incredibly permeable, it can be completely sealed fault. And that might not be the most, in this case, actually, that turned out that fault parameter didn't affect my predictions. So that was a very strong case that I could make. Well, I varied that parameter over 5 orders of magnitude, which is more than I know. Well, that's bigger range than I think it would be. That is reasonable. But even then, it did not affect my predictions. So, but then putting that 5 orders of magnitude into a report also highlights the issue that we don't know what it is, and we need more data to characterize that.
Look, thanks so much for this, Luke. It's been covering a huge amount of ground in a short space of time, and you've done it wonderfully. Thanks so much, and thanks so much everybody for your insightful questions. They're highly engaging. Really appreciated all your efforts and time on this. Thank you, everyone. Just a reminder for your feedback forms that will come up when you close out of this, and also there will be a recording sent to you along with the PowerPoint. And can I just put in a quick ad for the future webinars coming up on the 11th of May? We'll be doing heck grass water modelling with Craig Price, Rob Keller, and Mark Forrest. people who have worked with the authors of ECRAS in the US. And the 25th of May, we'll be hearing from SA Water CEO Roch Giroux on smart water grids. So we'd really look forward to seeing you again then. Thank you everybody for coming, and it's been a great time. Thank you again. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. See you.